Hello, I am back. I am going to read King George V, and this topic is entitled The Great War, and it's chapter 6. Before I get started, I wanted to let you know that this book can be found on thriftbook.com. It's a discount bookstore of older books, and from what I could tell, the cost was like $8, $10. So I put a link in my description about where you can buy the book if you're interested. But what I've been doing is reading this so people can hear it. I know I'm not a professional, but I just find the whole topic of King George V is so fascinating. And this is him during World War I. So I'm going to get started because this was a war that came up during his time. He had a politically turbulent issues were coming up during his reign, and he had to be the monarch when World War I was coming about, and we'll read more about that. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So it has 6 different chapters or sections that it discusses during the Great War chapter: the House of Windsor, Austerity, With the Troops, Business as Usual, Fisher Overboard, Haig versus French, Lloyd George versus Asquith, and Defending the Generals, and when Tsar Nicholas was abandoned, and his 2 princes, David, Prince Edward, who was then the Prince of Wales, and Bertie, who eventually became King George VI. They were serving in the military during World War I, and this book discusses, the impact of the war. And also the final topic is victory. So I'm going to go ahead and get started reading this. The dedication of duty, which had sustained the king through 4 uneasy years of peace, sufficed to meet the heavier strains of war. He asked nothing of himself. Popular acclaim he left to his ministers, glory to the fighting men. His own role was unobtrusive, to carry on the business of a constitutional monarch. He must know all, yet relinquish ultimate responsibility, ease the path for his government while safeguarding those prerogatives which in the stress of war could so easily be lost forever. He was also required to exhort the nation to victory, to place himself at the head of the armed forces who waged war in his name. He donned the mantle of King Henry V with diffidence. He would always do his best, but he was not a born leader. The cheers outside the palace saluted the symbol rather than the man. He embodied his people's pride, but still had to win their affection. Like his father, he cherished the heretic trappings of the monarchy: crowns and scepters, robes and regalia, ceremonial and precedents. Yet he could not radiate that warmth with which King Edward reached out into the hearts of his subjects. In vain, Stamfordham begged him to display, in public, some of the geniality which had delighted guests at his own table. "We sailors," the king replied, "never smile on duty." The effect was dispiriting. Raymond Asquith, the prime minister's eldest son, wrote from France, where he was serving with the Grenadier Guards, "The king came to see us this morning, looking as glum and dyspeptic as ever." It was not quite the kind of criticism which the king minded. He would rather thought to be a dull dog than an advertising sort of fellow, a phrase which ranked high in his vocabulary and contempt. The young Prince of Wales once referred enthusiastically to something the king had done as good propaganda. His father rebuked him. "I do things because they are my duty, not propaganda." For all these self-imposed handicaps, the king eventually, and much to his own surprise, achieved popularity. A kindliness and a common sense hitherto known only to a circle of intimates became public knowledge. What still remained concealed from all but a handful of ministers and officials was his moral courage, a conviction that civilized values must not be sacrificed to the clamor of patriotism. In war, as in peace, he struggled to preserve the decencies. The king's determination to love his enemies, even though they must ultimately be defeated, began with Albert Mensdorff. For 8 days after the outbreak of hostilities between Britain and Germany, the ambassador remained at his post in London, hoping against hope that the conflict between Austria and Russia would not provoke a declaration of war from Russian allies, Britain and France. During that period of suspense, Mensdorff could have expected correctness, perhaps courtesy, yet hardly cordiality. On 9 August, however, he was summoned to Buckingham Palace for tea. Entering, though, a side gate to avoid journalists and photographers, he found his royal cousin as friendly and good-natured as one could possibly be. Mensdorff reported to Vienna. The king expressed the hope there would not come to a state of war between England and Austria-Hungary. He said that England had gone to war about the neutrality of Belgium and the protection of French frontiers, not about Serbia and the Balkan question. It was not to be. The respite lasted only as long as it took France to bring back her troops from North Africa, safe from the interception by Austria's Mediterranean fleet. On the 12th of August, a day that in happier times marked the beginning of the king's annual grouse shooting holiday in Yorkshire, Britain and France had declared war on Austria. Mensdorff wrote in his diary, "An hour later, I received a letter from the KingGeorge speaking of our old friendship and our lifelong intimacy and expressing the hope of later welcoming you back to London. It's really touching. It must indeed be without precedent in history that at the same time as the declaration of war, the sovereign writes such a letter to the ambassador beginning, 'My dear Albert,' and ending, 'Ever your devoted friends and cousins, George and Mary.'" The king was not alone in his tenderness for Austria. Although it was Austria's deliberately harsh ultimatum to Serbia which had set Europe alight, she remained almost guiltless in England's eyes. Lord Harewood, the Yorkshire landowner, whose son was later to marry the king's only daughter, wrote to Mensdorff on the 14th of August, "It is lamentable that your nation and ours should be at war, for we owe you no grudge except for having put the match to the fire. The British people show no such indulgence to Germany. As confident in Allied victory before Christmas gave way to the enemy's advance on Paris and the retreat of the British expeditionary force, derision turned to a near hysterical hatred of all things German. Men and women bearing the Teutonic names for all their long resistance and unblemished character, were rivaled as traitors, arrested and imprisoned without trial. Spies were reported from every corner of the realm. Lord Kirchner, a newly appointed Secretary of State for War, had solemnly to assure the cabinet that lights seen flashing over Sandringham during a German air assault were caused by the car of the rector returning home after dinner. It became as unpatriotic to consume German wine as to keep a dachshund. Although John Morley would have known none of that nonsense. Rebuked for drinking hock, he replied, "I am interning it." The king, too, kept a sense of proportion. He was disturbed by the campaign of vilification waged against two delicate public servants because of their supposed German sympathies. Admiral Prince Louis of Battenberg and Lord Haldane. Prince Louis was a member of the Hesse family, and had indeed been born a German. But at the age of 14, he became a naturalized British subject and joined the Royal Navy as a cadet. Marriage to a granddaughter of Queen Victoria was no obstacle to his promotion. After nearly half a century of service, he reached the pinnacle of his profession as the first Sea Lord. What he lacked in imagination was more than a balance by history and attention to detail. In the last days of July 1914, when it fell to him to mobilize the fleet, the operation was carried out with prompt efficiency. Even that, however, was not enough to protect a man with a German name and accent from public insult. His younger son, the future Earl Mountbatten of Burma, then a naval cadet, wrote to his mother from Osborne, "What do you think the latest rumor that has got in here from the outside is? That Papa has turned out to be a German spy and has been discreetly marched off to the Tower, where he is guarded by beefeaters. I got rather a rotten time for it, for about 3 days." The first Sea Lord's fate was scarcely less humiliating. After 2 months of vicious attacks by the popular press, Asquith wrote to Miss Stanley, "Our poor blue-eyed German will have to go." On the following day, Prince Louis resigned, driven to the painful conclusion that at his juncture my birth and patronage have the effect of impairing in some respects my usefulness on the Board of Admiralty. Honorable and patriotic to the end, he disappeared into private life, consoled by the empty distinction of a privy councillorship. "I feel for him deeply," the king wrote in his diary. "There is no more loyal man in this country." It took a few months longer to eject Lord Haldane from the woolsack. As a vigorous and far-sighted Secretary of War from 1906 to 1912, he forged 3 essential weapons: an expeditionary force, a territorial army, and a general staff. Those achievements counted for nothing when set against the chance remark, dropped at dinner one night in 1912, and later made public by his host, that Germany was his spiritual home. It was useless for him to explain that he had been referring to his studies in philosophy at Göttingen University 40 years earlier. At the height of a disparaging campaign against him, the Lord Chancellor received 2,600 abusive letters in a single day. Asquith, overwhelmed by the pressures of war and politics, felt unable to protect his old friend, whom he excluded from the reconstructed government of 1915. "I make no complaint," Haldane observed. "In time of war, it is also only natural." The king had a high regard for his ill-used minister. Unlike Edward VII, who would refer to Haldane as a damn radical lawyer and a German professor, he was put off neither by Haldane's excursions into Hegelian metaphysics nor by his ponderous manner. What Admiral Fisher called his elephantine sinuosities. In 1912, when Haldane exchanged the War Office for the woolsack, the king suggested to him that he would well combine not only those two offices, but also that of ambassador to Berlin. Repeating the compliment in a letter to his mother, Haldane felt it necessary to explain. This was his joke. Three years later, the king could not save him from what, at that time, seemed to be political extinction, but to demonstrate to the world his own continuing confidence in Haldane, he conferred on him the Order of Merit. It's a distinction that lay within the sovereign's personal gift. At the end of the war, when the king held a victory parade of London tutorials, he insisted that Haldane should stay by his side. It was not only on behalf of those fallen Titans that the king demonstrated his compassion. He also secured the release of two unhappy members of the Gottlieb German band, whose pre-war popularity in London had failed to protect them from internment. At a time when few were prepared to defend the rights of conscientious objectors, he tried to prevent their internment in Dartmoor, the bleakest of criminal prisoners. The bleakest of criminal prisons. And when Prince Henry wrote from Eton to ask whether he could go and look at a camp for German prisoners of war, the boy received a stern rebuke. "I think it is in very bad taste, and I don't wish you go there at all. How would you like it if you were a prisoner for people to come and stare at you as if you were a wild beast?" The king reacted with contemptuous anger to the enemy's methods of warfare. The sinking of unarmed merchant vessels provoked the comment, "It is simply disgusting that naval officers could do such things, and that the haphazard bombing of civilian targets by Zeppelin airships he condemned as simply as murder." Yet he disdained any suggestion that the Germans should be repaid in kind. Stamfordham wrote on his behalf to the Prime Minister. The king yields to no one in abominating the general conduct of the Germans throughout this war. But nonetheless, he deprecates the idea of reprisals and retaliation. He has always hoped that at the end of the war, we shall, as a nation, stand before the world as having conduct in it as far as possible with humanity and like gentlemen. Those were courageous sentiments to express in April 1915. The king similarly disapproved of an admiralty order that the British merchant ships should fly the flag of the United States, who had not yet entered the war, in order to deceive German submarines. He said he would rather be sunk under his own flag. It may be that the king carried his quixotry too far. His resistance to the erosion of civil standards was not confined to the sinking of merchant ships, the bombing of civilians, and the ill treatment of prisoners of war. He also objected to proposals that the Kaiser and his family should be deprived of honorary commands of British regiment, that their garter banners should be removed from St. George's Chapel, that they all and other enemies should be stripped of their honorary appointments to the British Orders of Chivalry. For him, those pre-war exchanges of uniforms and ribands, they were part of history and should be left undisturbed. Queen Alexandra, in a letter to her son, echoed the widespread resentment of his subjects. Although as a rule I never interfere, she said, I think the time has come when I must speak out. It is but right and proper for you to have done those hateful German banners in our sacred church at St. George's in Windsor. With reluctance, the king yielded and the banners were removed. Otherwise, he told a friend, the people would have stormed the chapel. Trivial in themselves, such episodes did the king harm. They seemed to indicate the survival of a royal trade union that cut across national loyalties. Even Asquith looked askance when the king explained to him that his cousin, Prince Albert of Schleswig-Holstein, was not really fighting on the side of the Germans, but had only been put in charge of a camp of English prisons, which was near Berlin. A nice distinction, the Prime Minister observed satirically to Venetia Stanley. Lloyd George was more brutal. On receiving a summons to the palace in January 1915, he remarked to his secretary, I wonder what my little German friend has got to say to me. In spite of an ancestry that for centuries had thrived on infusions of German blood, the king considered himself to be wholly and impregnably British. When H.G. Wells spoke of an alien and uninspiring court, the king retorted, I may be uninspiring, but I'll be damned if I'm alien. Habits, opinions, pastimes, devotions, dress, all were indistinguishable from those of any other old-fashioned English country gentleman. The queen, too, would refer to herself as English from top to toe. She was the first consort for 400 years to speak the language as her mother tongue, albeit with a slight guttural accent from which her husband was entirely free. Both, therefore, were mortified by whispers that doubted their wholehearted support for the Allied cause. Such rumors were confined to a tiny minority, the malicious, the Republican, and the simple-minded. But as the casualties of battle mounted year by year, they were joined by embittered victims of suffering or grief. The wartime conduct of the king and queen was austere in private and tireless in public. Should in itself have been enough to refute such slanders. But in 1917, with what seems to have been a momentary loss of nerve, the king was determined to restore confidence by means of a theatrical gesture. He would rid the royal family of its Germanic taint by proclaiming his dynasty the House of Windsor. If a change had to be made, Lord Stamfordham's suggestion of Windsor was inspired, recalling it as it did the best known and most beautiful of English silhouettes outside the capital. It was ancient, it was sturdy, and it was benevolent. Yet what did the new name replace? Gulf was the historic patronymic of the House of Hanover, Wetton that of the Prince Consort. Neither of those names, however, were used or even known outside the field of genealogy. Lord Rosebery, who, as the most historically minded of living prime ministers, was consulted at every stage. He warned Stamfordham that the enemy to be feared on such a question is ridicule. In Britain, the proclamation was received with a renewal of patriotic fervor. Germany was less respectful. The Kaiser let it be known that he would be delighted to attend a performance of the well-known opera, The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The ultimate judgment on the creation of the House of Windsor came from a Bavarian nobleman, Count Albrecht von Monteglass. The true royal tradition died on that day in 1917 when, for a mere war, King George V changed his name. A more practical and timely measure accompanied the proclamation of the House of Windsor. Members of the royal family were enjoined to relinquish all German degrees, styles, dignities, titles, honors, and appellations. Sir Frederick Ponsonby, an authority on such matters, explained the edict to his wife with his usual drollery. The king came to the conclusion that something must be done about the names of the royal family. Here we are breeding innumerable Battenbergs and Tecks, and they are forever to remain princes of Battenberg and dukes and princes of Teck. He accordingly sent for Prince Louis, whose whole attitude was splendid. He said, of course, it's absurd that I should be a prince of Battenberg. But when the war broke out, I did not want to be like Schmidt, who became a smith. I have been educated in England and have been in England all my life. I am absolutely English, and if you wish me to become now Sir Louis Battenberg, I will do so. The king explained he did not wish that, but would like to make him a peer. His Serene Highness, Prince Louis of Battenberg, accordingly relinquished his German style and title, assumed the angelized surname of Mountbatten. He assumed the angelized name of Mountbatten. Hello?
Hi, good morning. Is this Benita Ewert?